Welcome, everybody. I'm really pleased to be here and happy to try to share some of what I've learned over the years in teaching qualitative data analysis with MAXQDA. Oh, and of course, now my screen's not forwarding. Let me try one more time. There we go. So the first question that I think it's useful to ask yourself is whether you're teaching analysis or software. So I've been doing this for about 20 years, and it used to be that we often were teaching folks who already knew how to do qualitative data analysis by hand, and they wanted to add software to their skill set. I find that now I'm more often teaching both at the same time. So most often my software learners are also novice analysts. So I really recommend teaching software and theory in parallel. I typically give an overview of the process of analysis, a brief software demonstration, applied practice in class or as homework, and then also review and debrief in each session. So I'll go through kind of my process for each of these things. So I usually use a combination of lecture, discussion, demonstration, and application of analysis. So part of this is to make sure that you're mixing up the time, that you don't do 2 hours of lecture and then a little bit of discussion and then 2 hours of software demonstration. I find it's much more useful to do a mini lecture with a very specific software skill that you can give some practice and application of the skill before you pick up again. So by way of example, I typically give a lecture of what I call the tools and the processes of analysis. And then we do a discussion of some articles that use different analytic approaches. I will then give them an introduction to MAXQDA, very high level, with a fully built project so they can see where are the documents, where are the codes, what does it look like where codes are applied, what do memos look like in each of those places. So be able to kind of show the different elements of the project in the context of a built document. So when I lay the foundation, I like to give a core lecture on what is your primary data, what are the things that you build into analysis, like codes and memos and variables, and then what's the process? How do you start? How do you develop codes? How do you apply codes? How do you check the application? Go through each of those processes, but remember that the tools are what we're learning to interact with. So I typically will provide an overview of the content. So let me back up for a second. So really the point here is that when you're teaching analysis and also software, one of the things that I like to do is start with a presentation that's really for novice learners, because it will make sure that everybody's on the same page. Different people mean different things by terms like content analysis, codes, nodes. Making sure that you give a little bit of a foundational lecture at the beginning, make sure that you have the same sort of foundational knowledge as you're starting to develop your approach to analysis of the software. So I start by talking about the tools of analysis. What are memos? What are codes? How do you segment text? And how do you employ variables? Each of these things we talk about one-on-one, and then we talk about the process. So you use memos and segments as those are the search results. You are able to search for segments of data, and you use both codes and variables to search that data. So talking about the process and how you might start with memos and then move towards developing codes, or you might code and then write memos based on the analysis that you're seeing of your coded data. I like to introduce some empirical articles early on. And the three that I typically use, one uses a memo-driven strategy, one uses a case-based analysis, and the other uses thematic analysis. And so I make sure that they have read those papers before they come into the session. And then in small groups, we'll have 3 groups, each one look at one of the papers and describe the analysis process, and also really look at the methods section to see how transparent the description of the analysis is. I'd like to give an overview of the fully built project because it really allows a demonstration of key features and functions, but you want to be careful not to overwhelm. So, you can this is not meant to be a full software review. I don't think you need to go through one by one and present all the click functions of the software. I really think that orienting learners to the program around specific functions is a lot more direct and useful. So I will typically start with a fully built project, describe the 4 windows, what the codes and coding stripes look like, how to change segmentation, learning what to do with memos on documents, codes, and text. And then the basics of activation and activation by variables, so that you get a sense for sort of all the key components that we need to build into our analysis project to have all those elements there and be able to move forward. So this is an example of what I might show. So I'll show that you see here, there are some memos. You have memos on the documents. You have code memos with your definitions. Oh, sorry. Just to be able to show them that the basic orientation of the program. And then let's talk a little bit about workshop structure and data. So I usually provide secondary data for at least the first half of a semester-long course. I do this because I find that the learning of students really depends on the quality of their data. So in prior semesters, when I've had students bring their own data, sometimes when they find that their data is rather thin, it can be difficult, for example, to write thick descriptive memos on data that's relatively thin. So I like to make sure that I provide some data that's got richness to it already, that will enable students to learn the key functions and the key practices of data analysis, and then they can apply that to whatever data set they want to work with afterwards. The other thing that secondary data allows you to do is to model team-based exercises. So I will have students in groups of 5 or 6 that everybody codes the same transcript and then looks at the coding for each of the different participants and see how they did with their analysis. If you're using a client's data for your workshop, you want to assess that data first and see if it really is rich and thick enough to demonstrate the concepts and skills that you want to be able to demonstrate. And you want to ask yourself if you can become familiar enough with that data to develop meaningful exercises and discussion. This is really more for a workshop with a client, where maybe they have their own data that you want to consider, and think about whether their data or, for instance, the demonstration data for the program is going to be more applicable for your session. I typically use a data set with 4 life history interviews. Each learner focuses on one transcript, so we have 5 or 6 learners per transcript. And then we alternate between individual software practice, like writing memos, and team-based analysis discussions. So I'll merge all the files. It's actually a teamwork combination. but I will bring those files all together so that each member of the team can see what other members of the team have written in their memos or how they have coded. I'm not going to go over this slide in detail. I usually think in terms of 3-hour blocks. I just find that that works really well to have a short to medium-sized lecture, some software demonstration, some practice, and then discussion with, at least one 15-minute break every 3 hours. It's a little bit tricky, I find, to teach qualitative analysis because it is so iterative, but learners want a linear description of how to do it. So I think it's helpful to note that the process isn't linear, but you can outline a linear fashion and then build in the iterative pieces. I usually start with memos. I think it's one of the most underused tools of qualitative data analysis, but it's also a great way for learners to start interacting with data. Typically, I've asked them to read through the transcripts, all 4 transcripts before we start a course, but then they need a little time to get a bit deeper into one particular transcript. So we have them write memos, and I think this is a great way to really open up what's going on and see the depth in the data. I explain the difference between merge and teamwork functions. I can fill that in the Q&A section if you'd like, if you don't know the difference between those two. And it is fun to have them review. This is an example of memos and how they can review memos. But it's fun to have them review. I think I've got a slide coming up in a little bit that will show you what the coding looks like when you have multiple people there. So one of the things that I really like to do, and it works really well in a class, is to think about concrete examples that help to clarify relatively abstract processes. So one of the exercises that I've developed is around coding and code definitions. So why is it? And I think there's always a little bit of an issue between identifying concepts that you want to understand from your data, but then you have to define them in a certain way in order to grab that data, right? So the example that I give to clarify this is, do we know what a Hawaiian shirt is? Does everybody know what a Hawaiian shirt is? We go through a little process of eliciting the characteristics. Usually people say things like, they're colorful, it's a colored shirt with buttons, a button down, has a pocket, short sleeves. They're usually loose fitting. What else? They usually have like beachy themes if they're images, flowers, palm trees, etc. Anyway, so we might say, okay, this is our definition. The scenario is you're the costume designer for a theater production, and you need to go buy Hawaiian shirts for the theater production. And you need to give your buyer instructions on what to buy. So we go through this list of identifying what is a Hawaiian shirt and all the characteristics, and then we look at some examples. So we talk through which of these is a Hawaiian shirt according to the definition that we came up with. And then we talk about, well, what if we wanted to include number 3, for instance, that maybe isn't as colorful, or even number 4 may not be as colorful as what we were thinking of originally. And how do we need to change that definition depending on what we want our buyer to purchase? And then I complicate it a little bit more by saying, okay, now what about bachelors number 1 through 4 on this image? And which of them are wearing Hawaiian shirts? So here we typically get like bachelor number 2 is not because he's wearing long sleeves. So typically long sleeves means that it's not a Hawaiian shirt. But you may decide for theoretical reasons that you want to include that. And I usually change the scenario at this point and say, you know, what if instead of a theater production that you needed to buy these shirts for, what if you were throwing a 70th birthday party for your uncle? And in that case, who would you turn away? So that actually kind of changes the research question, right? So what I'm trying to do is illustrate that what we think we know, we may think we know what something is just instinctively, but we need to actually define them so that we know what we're looking for in the data. And the process of interacting with data is really important in developing the definitions that will help us know what it is we want to put in that bucket for a particular code. And it's important to highlight, for instance, in these images, that context matters. You know, the hipster bachelor number 4 here, I've had folks say, well, that's not really a Hawaiian shirt. Look how snug it is, and hipsters don't wear Hawaiian shirts. So the context can complicate things a little bit. All right, let me move on. So this just describes the process that I've just described to you. And codebook development, we usually move from the Hawaiian shirt exercise. Everybody has written memos, and then we go on to say, okay, what do we want to code for? We come up with a research question for the 4 interviews that we're discussing, and start developing. I usually aim for maybe 8 to 10 codes. I do have pre-coded data from when this project was conducted, so I can give that to them coded afterwards. And I like to give them to use a few of those codes, maybe six of the codes that we originally used for the project. But I also like to develop at least 2 or 3 new codes that are really inductively based on our conversations in the class. And I try to have at least 1 or 2 definitions that are what I would call relatively bad. What I mean by that is that they're a little bit ambiguous, or they're a little bit too conceptual to be able to know the code when you see it. And I do this because I think it's important for learners to know what it feels like to apply a poorly defined code. They will then code their transcripts, export teamwork. I then combine all the teamwork and show them how to review and discuss their discrepancies in order to improve their code definitions and the inclusion and exclusion criteria. So this is what that process looks like. You'll see over here on the left, I ask them to put their initials at the end of the code name so that they won't automatically be combined. And then it gets really messy in the coding side of things. So what I like to do is I'll go down to, if you right click in the area here where the codes are visualized, what I'll do is I'll go ahead and activate all of the condom and contraception codes, and then right click here and select to see only the activated codes, and that allows you to focus on 1 code at a time. Sorry, I've scrolled through that really quickly. So this gives you a chance to let participants come look at the text that's been coded and talk about any discrepancies. In this case, it's really just a discrepancy in segmentation, but sometimes you'll find that there's only 1 or 2 and who have applied the code in a particular spot, and I ask them to read those that text and discuss as a group whether they think the code applies, why it applies, whether it applies with the current definition or whether it's something that we want to capture, but it doesn't fit the current definition, so we need to make a definition change. So here's another example of, and I realize we're down to about 5 minutes, so I will try to stop on time so you can ask questions. So when I get to the point of starting to talk about what you do with coded data, I like to talk about identifying properties and dimensions. And this is a spot where I do, again, an applied exercise that I think helps make it more concrete for students. And I do this looking at fruit. I'll show you the images of the fruit in just a minute. But we talk first about, in analysis, that you want to focus on patterns and variations. We talk about what's the difference between properties and dimensions and how it is that we can describe aspects of our coded data. And then we go straight into the fruit exercise. So I've got about 15 types of fruit that I put on index cards. And in groups of 3 or 4, I ask them to do 2 things. First, I ask them to sort the fruit into piles representing categories. So it can be types. That could be, berries versus citrus. It could be how they grow, whether it's a vine fruit or a ground fruit, tree fruit. Could be what part of the world it comes from. So just for them to take an inductive category and sort the fruit. And then to do another sorting of the data along a continuum or a dimension. So there, one of the things that works really well is like either the sweetness of the fruit, which I always say, assume maximum ripeness or perfect ripeness, or you could talk about the edibility of the skin. And it's always interesting to see that, for instance, a fruit like kiwi, you'll come up with different notions of whether the skin is edible or not in different groups. So you have to then talk about how it is that you want to describe those decisions that you make and how you're going to describe your data. So these are the fruit that I use. These are just Google images, and you can, be sure you're careful about Creative Commons licenses and such, so you can use these things. So I use these images, I cut them into little pieces so they can sort them easily. And you can also do this within Max Maps if you want to bring in, it's a little more work, but you can bring in the pictures into Max Maps and use that to demonstrate how you can sort things within Max Maps into groups or along a continuum. So, closing workshops activities. Once you have covered one example of analysis procedures, you might want to talk through another type of analysis. So, thematic analysis does not proceed exactly the same way that grounded theory does, but once you've done one approach to analysis, I think it's easier to say, okay, now that you know what these tools are, let's think about how we might use the tools differently for grounded theory or for narrative analysis. I typically review strategies for presenting data, so thinking about how to select quotes, how to present quotes, things like writing case studies, any of those kinds of things. Return to those analysis papers that we talked about at the beginning and really look at the analysis and the results and the believability of the analysis based on the description there, and ask them to assess the workshop. The final assignment that I typically give in a course is a brief analysis of the 4 transcripts that I have presented or that I've given them. I ask them to write an overview of at least one of the codes, identify and describe one property or dimension of the code using Max Maps. I ask them to compare the data for 2 groups on that code, and then I ask them to describe an intersection of that code with another code in the data set. So that would be an example kind of final assignment for an introductory course in qualitative data analysis. And I made it even quicker than I thought. That is the end of the presentation that I had for you, and I would love to go ahead and open up for questions. I see there are a few things in the chat. It looks like no questions in the chat. Good to see you all. And then in the Q&A. So Matthew, no, I have not experimented with using generative AI to create fictitious interviews or transcripts. I can imagine doing so. I wonder, I know that this is getting more and more, it's getting easier to do. I wonder if that data is really cohesive enough to give a really thorough understanding of how to do qualitative data analysis. So I'd be curious, Matthew, if you're doing this, I'd be curious to hear what your results have been so far. Concerning AI Assist, have you considered if you discuss with your students about that, and if so, when? So I personally I have not yet introduced the AI Assist in my courses. I would suggest doing that probably after having them do things by hand, and I would probably take them through a process where they're comparing their own work to the AI Assist, and where I would ask them to then assess the difference and see what their learning points can be from comparing those things. Summarizing for specific code. I think one of the things that I think is absolutely brilliant is the use of multiple languages now in MAXQDA and the AI Assist. So I do a fair amount of work in Spanish, and the ability to say, well, you take this Spanish segment and summarize it in English is a huge benefit for cross-cultural research and cross-lingual research. My code definition maps well. I'm not sure I'm following your question, Matthew, in the second one to see if your code definition is mapping well. So maybe we can talk about that personally. Here, any thoughts on maps or creative coding? I'd love to invite you to just fill me in a little bit more on what you're asking, Matthew, and open it up to others. Yeah, feel free to email me. I'm happy to answer questions there. Yeah, there is a free trial available. Camila's answering. I believe it's a 2-week free trial, and it's a full version of the program, which is really handy. You can really see everything that's available in the program. So Matthew, I do have them work in Max Maps. I have introduced creative coding in my advanced qualitative analysis course, where we do about half the course in thematic analysis, and then we move on to grounded theory and narrative analysis. And I do bring creative coding in as we kind of reapproach data from that perspective. So I will have students bring in data from a particular code and inductively sort that into categories. Creative coding, you can do the same thing, bring the codes into the creative coding space and play with how you might rearrange those codes, how you might regroup those codes into a hierarchy. I think doing that in a small group setting can be really insightful, and I think that would be a good form of group brainstorming in a smaller group. I'm not sure how well it would work in like the large classroom of 20 students or so. but they really like Max Maps and enjoy working with Max Maps. Other questions I might be able to address for folks? So Team Cloud, yes. I actually do not use Team Cloud, partly because I started doing this process years ago before it was available. I have a process that I've got pretty much down, that I can do the team, combining the team. And I typically do this with 20 or 25 students. So I may have 25 students who all code one transcript out of the four, and then I combine all 25 projects. So it takes a minute, and you have to be careful to make sure that you're, getting everything in together. But it's really powerful, I think, for students to see what they've all done together. And I'm sure the folks at MAXQDA could show you an easier way to do that with Team Cloud. But that typically I have not used Team Cloud. So again, let me just kind of summarize some key points for you. I think in terms of incorporating MaxQDA with teaching, I would really recommend, like what I typically do is introduce a function that typically I will try to introduce something that takes me only 5, maybe 10 minutes to present how to do it, and then give them some time actually implementing them. And we then allow them to take some of that time. Sorry, I was reading the next question as I was speaking and lost track a little bit. So what I typically do, we start by writing memos, and then from the memo writing, once we've talked about the memos and gotten a deeper sense of what's going on in the data, then we have a discussion about how to develop codes and code definitions. So we basically verbally, we inductively develop codes and definitions, and then they practice applying them. So, Lauren, that was your question there. I'm happy to stick around for a little bit yet. If you want to chat informally, or if you have other questions, I'm happy to help. And please feel free to email me as well if you have specific questions. I'm happy to help that way.
Yeah, I think we can just leave the chat open and also the Q&A for the last 9 minutes. So feel free to ask.
So I have done this approach. I've taken this approach with both workshops that are 3 to 5 days, and as well as semester-long courses. I have typically taught a 1-week course that's a 30-hour course. Typically, I'm teaching master's students. I think it would probably need to go a little bit slower for undergrad students, but still, I think all of this is relevant for undergrad students as well. Like maybe there's something else. More examples of properties and dimensions. So what I like to do with the fruit, so let me explain the fruit exercise a little bit. Is I'll say, okay, in your small group, take each of these fruits and line them up on a continuum for edibility of the seed. That actually may be a better property than a dimension. So the way I try to explain this to students, and this, of course, there's a deeper literature on this, but in class, I really try to say, you know, your properties are going to be more categorical. They're things that you're going to put into into groups, and the dimensions are going to be more along a continuum. So think about those things. But another way that I have talked about this actually with properties and dimensions, it's more a question of how you sort into these things. So for instance, I'll sometimes give an example of doing laundry. And this is really a question of Zoom and how small versus large you want to make your buckets in creating properties and dimensions of codes. So you could think of a laundry basket where you want to sort your delicates and your bedding and your towels and your sort of your business wear. Well, if I look at my laundry versus my son's laundry, for instance, the clothes that are in there are going to be different. So the data that you're looking at is going to be different. And when you start thinking about ways to sort, it will depend on what you see, right? So you want to start, and you can think about laundry as just an example, or scarves, for instance. If I have 25 scarves from different places that I've traveled to, how might I sort them so that I would be able to describe them? So one option might be to sort them by type of fabric. It could be silk, it could be cotton, it could be wool for cold weather. It could be by purpose, whether it's primarily to keep you warm or whether it's primarily decorative. So just to say that I encourage you to think about everyday examples that can help students to conceptualize and really understand what we mean by very conceptual concepts in qualitative analysis.